In Maple Hill, California, in the summer of 1955, there was one name you did not say out loud, not twice, not in the wrong company, not if you wanted to keep living the quiet life you had built. Roxanne Swisher was 26 years old, practical as a balance sheet, and she had never heard that name in her life. She came to Maple Hill on a Monday with a white floral dress, a brown leather satchel, and a newspaper ad folded in her pocket. Bookkeeper wanted, honest pay, discretion required. She was good with numbers, she needed work. She walked straight to the garage on Cinder Road, and she walked straight into the interview, and she took the job without hesitation, because why wouldn't she? He was just a mechanic, grease on his hands, sweat on his shirt, car keys he never seemed to put down, a quiet man, a serious man. That is what Roxanne thought. What Roxanne did not know, what the newspaper ad did not mention, what nobody in Maple Hill would ever write down, was that Troy V. Landis did not just own a garage. He owned the silence of 3 counties. He controlled every dollar moving through the valley's criminal underground, the gambling debts, the contraband routes, the men who made problems disappear, and the judges who never asked how. That gold signet ring on his right hand was not jewelry. It was the seal of a criminal dynasty that had run the San Joaquin Valley for 40 years. When Troy Landis said a thing was settled, it was settled. When he said something was his, nobody in 3 counties had ever successfully argued otherwise. Roxanne found all of this out by week 4. She traced the money, understood what the Thursday cars meant and who the silent men in the Bay were reporting to. She went home, she sat with it, she came back Monday morning. That was 6 weeks ago. Today, the hottest afternoon of the hottest summer anyone in Maple Hill could remember, Roxanne was at the door with her satchel when she saw them, 2 cars crossing the lot, moving with the deliberate, unhurried patience of men who answered to no one in this county, because the man they answered to is standing right behind her. They weren't here about the books. They had found the one thing Troy Landis had never allowed himself to have, a weakness, and they had come to use it. Troy was beside her in seconds. She felt the shift in him, not fear, nothing like fear, something colder than that. The precise, focused cold of a man who has handled worse than this and left no evidence. He stepped forward, 1 step, his body between hers and the men coming across that lot, and he said her name, just her name, quietly, like it was the only thing in 3 counties he had ever been careful with. The most feared man in the San Joaquin Valley was about to show his enemies exactly what he would do for one woman in a floral dress. And nothing, not his empire, not his rules, not 40 years of a dynasty built on never showing weakness, was going to stop him. Stay with me, because Troy Landis had spent 40 years building an empire on one principle: never let anyone see what you cannot afford to lose. Today, for the first time, everyone could see it, and she was standing right behind him. The Maple Hill Gazette was 4 pages that week. A church notice, a hardware sale, 1 car accident nobody had died in, and a job listing tucked in the bottom corner of page 3 like someone had placed it there hoping the wrong people wouldn't find it. Bookkeeper wanted, honest pay, cash weekly, discretion required, apply in person, Landis Automotive, 14 Cinder Road. Roxanne read it twice, folded the paper, put it in her dress pocket. She needed the work. She was good with numbers. That was the beginning and end of her thinking. It should have stayed that simple. She smelled the garage before she reached the door. Motor oil and hot metal, and something underneath both of those, a kind of cold, deliberate odor that working garages don't usually have. She stepped into the bay and understood why immediately. The tools on the pegboard hung in descending size, each outline traced in black paint so you could see at a glance what was missing and who had taken it. The red rollaway toolbox against the far wall had every drawer flush and closed. The concrete floor was clean, not recently clean, always clean, the kind of clean that comes from a standard nobody argues with. Everything in this garage was exactly where it was supposed to be. Roxanne was still reading the room when one of the men in the bay noticed her. There were 3 of them, big men, all of them, none of them in work clothes. They'd been talking in low voices near the back, the kind of conversation that stops completely when a stranger walks in. It stopped completely when Roxanne walked in. 3 pairs of eyes moved to her with the flat, assessing attention of men who are paid to assess things, and the temperature of the bay dropped about 10 degrees, despite the July heat pouring through the open door behind her. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward her. They just watched and waited, she realized, for someone else to decide what to do about her. Then the office door opened. Troy Landis filled the frame the way certain men fill rooms, not aggressively, not performing anything, simply as a fact of his size and the particular stillness he carried. Dark-haired, square-jawed, wearing a faded blue work shirt over a dirty white undershirt, grease on his forearms up to the elbow, and on his right hand, gold, heavy, sitting on his finger like a brand, a signet ring that saw 3 generations of Landis men and outlasted every enemy every one of them had ever made. The 3 men in the bay relaxed the instant they saw him, not because he said anything, not because he gestured, simply because Troy Landis had walked through a door, and whatever question his presence answered, it was enough. He looked at Roxanne. His expression gave nothing away. "Back office," he said. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't unfriendly. It was the voice of a man who says a thing once and doesn't check whether you're following because it hasn't occurred to him that you wouldn't. Roxanne followed. The office was small, metal desk, 2 chairs, a lamp throwing yellow light over the kind of filing disaster that made her fingers itch. Receipts stacked without logic, ledgers in no order she could identify, a coffee ring on what appeared to be a quarterly summary from 1953. She cataloged it all in the 30 seconds it took her to cross the room and sit down. On the back wall, between the door and the single window, a gray suit jacket hanging on a hook, pressed, alone, never touched by whatever work happened in the bay because the man who wore it became someone else entirely when he put it on. She noticed it. She said nothing. She sat down. Troy read her application letter in silence, set it down, looked at her with eyes that calculated distance the way other men calculate time, automatically, without effort, as a survival habit, so old it had become instinct. Double entry bookkeeping, walk me through a reconciliation discrepancy. She walked him through it. He didn't interrupt, already different from every employer she'd ever had. Bank reconciliation, monthly close, first thing you look for. Timing differences, she said. Then transposition errors, then fraud. Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of movement, there and gone before she could name it, like she'd said the correct answer to a question he hadn't meant to ask. He asked one more thing, slid it in at the end, easy as breathing. "You have people in Maple Hill?" "No," she said. He held her gaze, 1 beat, 2, long enough that she became conscious of the ceiling fan turning overhead, the muffled voices from the bay, and the very specific quality of being looked at by a man who never asks a question without needing the answer for a reason that has nothing to do with small talk. In 3 counties, when Troy Landis looked at you that way, you understood without being told that you had just been weighed, that the life you lived after this moment depended on what the scale said, that there was no court of appeal. "You start Monday," he said. Roxanne nodded, stood, picked up her satchel, walked out. She paused at the threshold of the garage bay on her way through, the open mouth of the building, the dust-white lot blazing beyond it, the bleached afternoon pressing down on everything. Behind her, the cool shadow of the garage, the 3 men who had gone back to their quiet conversation, the gray suit jacket on its hook, the man who wore a criminal empire seal on his right hand like it was nothing. Ahead, the ordinary world. She stood between them for just a moment. Then she walked into the light. That night, she wrote to her mother, "I got the position. The garage is well organized. My employer is a man of very few words. Maple Hill seems quiet." She sealed the envelope, set it on the nightstand, lay in the dark listening to the ceiling fan. She didn't mention the 3 men who'd watched her like she was a problem to be solved. She didn't mention the signet ring, or the gray suit jacket, or the way Troy Landis had said, "You start Monday," not like he was offering her a job, but like he was making a decision about something that went considerably further than bookkeeping. She told herself she hadn't mentioned those things because they weren't relevant. She was very good with numbers. She was considerably less honest with herself. Roxane had the filing system rebuilt by end of day Tuesday. Not reorganized, rebuilt. Every receipt dated and cross-referenced. Every ledger labeled, spined, and shelved in the order a working bookkeeper actually needs them, which is to say, in the order that makes the money make sense. She threw away a cardboard box of duplicates that had been sitting behind the desk long enough to develop their own ecosystem, and she found, underneath it, a quarterly summary from 1952 that nobody had ever reconciled. She reconciled it. Then she reconciled the 13 months that came after it. Then she started on the current year. By Wednesday afternoon, the office looked like a different room. By Thursday morning, Roxane had found the discrepancy. She almost missed it. Almost, but the number was wrong in the specific, deliberate way that only looked like an error if you were moving too fast to notice that the same kind of wrong had appeared 4 times before it, each exactly 6 weeks apart, each routed through a different company name that dissolved into nothing when she tried to trace it. Roxane set her pencil down. She had been a bookkeeper for 4 years. She had found genuine errors before. Transpositions, timing gaps, the occasional creative interpretation of what constituted a business expense. What she had never found, until this moment, was money that moved with this kind of patience, this kind of architecture. Whoever had built this pattern into the books had done it knowing that most bookkeepers would never look carefully enough to find it, and had done it anyway, month after month, with the calm confidence of someone operating inside a system that protected them. A system, she understood, sitting very still in the yellow lamplight of Troy Landis's back office, that Troy Landis himself controlled entirely. She sat with that for a long time. Then she opened the ledger back to the beginning and started again from the top. Because whoever was skimming from the most feared man in 3 counties had been doing it for at least 18 months, and they had been doing it carefully, and Roxane Swisher was better at this than they had counted on. She was going to find every single dollar. What she was going to do with what she found, that question she left for now on the shelf beside the 1952 quarterly summary, filed under "Not Yet Decided." She was still at the desk when the light through the office window turned amber and the sounds from the garage bay went quiet one by one. The radio first, then the voices, then the last vehicle pulling out of the lot. The whole building settled into the particular silence of a place that had been full of men and wasn't anymore. Then footsteps in the bay, unhurried, certain, the kind of footsteps that didn't slow down to check whether they were welcome. Troy filled the office doorway the way he filled every space he entered, not aggressively, not performing anything, simply as a physical fact that the room rearranged itself around. He was still in the work shirt, still marked with the evidence of the day. The signet ring caught the lamplight as he rested one hand on the doorframe, and for a moment he simply looked at the office, the rebuilt shelves, the labeled ledgers, the cleared desk, with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. "You reorganized the archive." "It wasn't organized," Roxane said. "Nobody has touched that archive in 2 years." She looked up at him. "I noticed." He held her gaze. The ring glinted. Somewhere in the building, something ticked. A cooling engine, a settling wall, the ordinary sounds of a garage at the end of a day. Troy Landis stood in her doorway and looked at Roxanne Swisher the way he had looked at her in the interview. That same flat, precise attention, weighing something, calculating something, arriving at a conclusion he kept entirely to himself. Then he said good night, pushed off the doorframe, walked back through the bay, and she heard the heavy exterior door close behind him, and then the lot outside went quiet. Roxanne realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out, slowly. Set her pencil down on the open ledger, pressed both palms flat against the desk the way she did sometimes when she needed to feel something solid. He had looked at the rebuilt archive and said nothing about what it meant that she had found her way that deeply into his files. He had looked at her and said nothing about the fact that a bookkeeper thorough enough to reconcile 1952 was also thorough enough to find things he may not have wanted found. He had said goodnight and walked away, and the thing Roxanne could not organize into any clean column was this. The man who controlled the silence of 3 counties had just looked directly at her and chosen, deliberately, to say nothing. In her experience, powerful men only stayed quiet about things they had already decided were theirs. She arrived at 6:53 on a Thursday morning because the quarterly summary was 12 pages from finished, and Roxanne had never in her professional life handed anyone a 12 pages from finished quarterly summary when she could have handed them a complete one. She heard the lot before she saw it. Engines that had no business being warm at this hour. Voices, low, male, deliberate, carrying through the garage walls the way sound carries through buildings that are pretending to be quieter than they are. She came around the corner and stopped. 3 cars she had never seen before sat in the lot at angles that were not accidental. Dark vehicles, expensive in the understated way of things bought to move without being noticed. The men standing near them were cut from the same cloth, large, unhurried, wearing the particular expression of people who are paid to project calm in situations that are not calm. One of them clocked her the moment she appeared and said nothing, which was somehow louder than if he had spoken. The garage bay was open. She walked to the threshold and looked in. Troy was standing at the center of the bay with 2 men she had never seen before, and he was not wearing the work shirt. He was wearing the gray suit jacket. She had wondered, in the 3 weeks since she first noticed it hanging alone on its hook, what it looked like on him. Now she knew, and the answer rearranged several things she had been telling herself about the nature of her employment. It fit the way expensive things fit men who have worn expensive things long enough that the clothes stop looking like clothes and start looking like authority. The gray was charcoal, serious, precise, the color of a decision already made. Under it, a white shirt, no tie, collar open, which somehow made it worse rather than better, because it suggested a man who did not need the full costume to communicate what he was. The signet ring was still on his right hand. Of course it was. The ring was always there. The men he was speaking to were not mechanics. They were not customers. They stood the way men stand when they are reporting to someone, and they had gone completely silent the moment Roxanne appeared in the doorway. Not because they were startled, but because Troy had not yet indicated what to do about her. And in this room, in this building, nothing happened until Troy indicated. He turned and looked at her. Something moved across his face, fast, controlled, gone before she could fully read it. Not quite alarm, more the expression of a man who has kept 2 rooms in his life carefully separated and has just watched the wall between them develop a crack. The whole bay held its breath. Troy crossed to her in 4 steps. He moved the way he always moved, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once needed to rush because things have always arranged themselves according to his schedule. When he reached her, he was close enough that she could see the fine weave of the jacket, the slight weathering at the collar of the shirt beneath it, the absolute steadiness of his eyes. "You're an hour early." His voice was the same as always. Low, even, giving nothing away, as if he were not standing in the middle of a criminal empire's Thursday morning operations in a suit that costs more than her monthly rent. "I wanted to finish the quarterly summary before the phone traffic starts," she said. He held the door open for her without another word, a gesture so ordinary it felt almost absurd in context. A man who ran the valley's underworld holding a door for his bookkeeper at 7 in the morning. She went through it. He followed her into the corridor and pulled the bay door closed behind them, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that wasn't quite a whisper, but wasn't meant for anyone except her. Don't come through the bay before noon on Thursdays. Not a question, not a request. The simple, final delivery of a man who states things once because stating them twice has never been necessary. "I'll be in shortly," he said. Then he went back through the door. Roxanne walked to the back office, sat down at her desk, opened the quarterly ledger to page 41 where she had stopped the night before. From the bay came the low murmur of resumed conversation, voices she couldn't make out, the occasional sound of something being moved, the quiet industry of men conducting business that would never appear in any ledger she was permitted to touch. She picked up her pencil, she began to write. Her handwriting was perfectly steady. She noted this the way she noted discrepancies, clinically, without judgment, as information about the state of things. She had known, sitting with the open ledger on Thursday of week 2, that she was going to come back. She had made that decision in the silence of her boarding house room, and she had not unmade it in the days since, and she was not unmaking it now, even with the gray suit jacket still vivid behind her eyes, and the voices of men she would never be introduced to filtering through the wall. She was staying. She had decided. What she had not yet decided, what she kept, still, on the same shelf at the 1952 quarterly summary and the question of the signet ring, was the part that came after staying, the part where she admitted, honestly, to herself, what it had felt like when Troy Landis crossed a room full of dangerous men in a gray suit jacket and spoke to her like she was the only thing in it that required his full attention. That part she was not ready to reconcile yet. She kept writing. The quarterly summary was not going to finish itself. Mrs. Eloise Beaumont had lived on Cinder Road for 31 years, which meant she had watched the Landis garage go up when Troy's father built it, watched it change hands when the father died, and watched it become something considerably more than a garage in the years since. She had watched all of this from her porch with the patience of a woman who understood that Maple Hill's secrets were not secrets so much as information in slow circulation, and that the only question was whether you were paying attention when they came around. She served tea on a Saturday afternoon, proper tea in proper cups, on the porch that overlooked the quiet end of Cinder Road, and she did not pretend. That was the thing about Mrs. Eloise. She had 31 years of Maple Hill behind her, and she had stopped pretending about most of it somewhere around year 4. "That ring he wears," she said. She was not looking at Roxanne. She was watching the street the way she always watched it, with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. A car passed. She noted it, filed it, kept talking. His grandfather wore it, his father wore it, before that his grandfather's father, though nobody in this valley remembers far enough back to say with certainty where it started, only that it has never stopped. She lifted her teacup, set it back down. In this valley, that ring means one thing. It has always meant one thing. It will go on meaning it long after every man who ever wore it is in the ground and the ground itself has forgotten their names. Roxanne kept her hands wrapped around her cup. The tea was too hot to drink, but she held it anyway for something to hold. "What does it mean?" she asked. Mrs. Eloise was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for words. She had had the words for years. The quiet of someone deciding how many of them to use. "That when Troy Landis says a thing is settled, it is settled," she said. "That when he says a thing is his, it is his." A pause, measured and deliberate. "That no one in this valley, not the law, not the competition, not God himself on a particularly motivated afternoon, has successfully taken anything from that family in 40 years. The street was empty now. Somewhere down the block, a screen door opened and closed. The heat sat on everything like a hand pressing down. 3 generations, Mrs. Eloise continued, still watching the road. 3 men wearing that ring, each one more careful than the last, each one with a longer list of people who tried to move against them and found that the valley has a long memory and Troy Landis has a longer one. She tilted her head slightly. The sheriff takes his coffee at the diner on Tuesdays. Troy Landis takes his at the same diner on Tuesdays. They sit 2 tables apart and they do not speak, and everyone in Maple Hill understands exactly what that arrangement means. Roxanne said nothing. She was thinking about the quarterly summary, about the ghost accounts, about the pattern she had found and the patience it had taken to build, and the specific kind of confidence it required to skim money from a man whose grandfather had worn a criminal dynasty seal on his right hand for 50 years. Someone, she thought, was either very brave or very stupid. She had not yet decided which. "He's never had a bookkeeper last more than a month," Mrs. Eloise said. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without particular emphasis, as simple information about the state of the world. They come, they look at the books, they leave. She finally turned and looked at Roxanne directly. Her eyes were the pale gray of someone who had seen enough of Maple Hill to be unsurprised by most of it, but there was something in them now. Not quite concern, not quite amusement, something sitting precisely between the two. "You're at 6 weeks," she said. Roxanne looked back at her, did not look away, did not reach for anything reassuring to say, because she had learned by now that Mrs. Eloise had no patience for reassurance and considerable respect for silence. They sat with it. The tea cooled, the street stayed empty. Then Mrs. Eloise picked up her cup, and the conversation moved on to other things, and nothing more was said about Troy Landis or the ring or the bookkeepers who had come and gone before Roxanne arrived. That night, Roxanne sat at the small writing desk in her room and wrote to her mother. "I think I may stay in Maple Hill for a while. The work suits me, the town is quiet, my landlady makes excellent tea." She sealed the envelope, set it on the nightstand beside the one she had written the week before, which she had also sealed and had not yet mailed, because she kept revising what she wanted to say and arriving at the same carefully edited version of the truth. She did not mention the ring. She did not mention that 6 weeks was apparently a record, or what it meant that she was still here to set it, or what Mrs. Eloise had said about the things Troy Landis claimed and the 40 years in which no one had successfully argued otherwise. She did not mention any of that. She mentioned the tea. Her mother wrote back every 2 weeks, always asking the same gentle questions. Was the work good? Was the town friendly? Had she made any friends yet? Roxanne always answered cheerfully and carefully, and the gap between what her letter said and what was actually happening had been widening since the first Monday morning she had walked through the bay at Landis Automotive and understood in the particular way numbers make things clear that she had taken a job that was going to cost her considerably more than her time. The only question left was what exactly she was willing to pay. The garage emptied out by 6 on most evenings. The mechanics left first, tools racked, bay swept, the radio clicking off mid-song. Then the other men, the ones who did not have job titles Roxanne was ever going to be told, filtering out through the side door in ones and twos with the quiet efficiency of people whose comings and goings were not meant to be noted. By 6:30, the lot was down to 2 vehicles, Roxanne's borrowed bicycle leaning against the wall, and whatever Troy was driving that week. She had been staying late most Tuesdays. She told herself it was the quarterly summary. It was partly the quarterly summary. The sound of him working came through the wall like a language she was starting to understand. The specific rhythm of a man who knows engines the way she knows ledgers, by feel and memory, by the small sounds that mean something is right, and the different small sounds that mean something isn't. Sockets turning, metal on metal. Long silences that meant concentration rather than absence, because she had learned by now the difference between the silence of an empty building and the silence of a building that contained Troy Landis. At 8:15, she found what she had been half expecting to find for the past 10 days, and she sat with it for exactly 4 minutes, she knew because she watched the clock, before she picked up the ledger and walked to the bay. He was on his back under the raised Buick, visible from the knees down, the rest of him swallowed by the undercarriage. The overhead light threw everything in the bay into sharp relief: the red toolbox, the pegboard, the greased dark concrete, and caught, as it always caught, the gold of the signet ring on his right hand where it rested against the engine casing. "I found another set," Roxanne said. The sound of work stopped. A pause, the specific pause of a man recalibrating. Then the rolling board scraped against the concrete and he emerged from under the car. Forearms black with grease to the elbow, work shirt open, face carrying the calm, unhurried expression he wore the way other men wore their names. He sat up, looked at her, said nothing, which with Troy Landis was always an invitation to continue. Another set of what? Of ghost accounts. The Fresno pattern, it's not random, it's a pipeline. Someone is skimming systematically and routing it outward through shell companies that dissolve before anyone looks twice. I can show you exactly where it's going, the full 18 months of it if you want me to. Troy stood. He did it the way he did everything, without effort, without announcement, simply arriving at vertical as a statement of fact. The bay was not a large space, and he was not a small man, and the distance between them, which had been professionally appropriate 30 seconds ago, had become something else without either of them moving toward it. "How long have you known about the first set?" he asked. "Day 3. The stillness that moved through him then was different from his ordinary stillness. It was the stillness of a man absorbing information that has weight, recalculating, in the space of a breath, everything he thought he understood about the woman standing in his garage at 8:15 on a Tuesday evening, with his criminal empire's paper trail open in her hands. "And you said nothing." It was not quite a question. It was the observation of a man who controlled 3 counties and had built that control on knowing, precisely and completely, everything that happened inside his operation, and had just discovered a gap he had not known was there. "I was deciding what I thought," Roxanne said. "I've decided." "And?" She held his gaze. His eyes in the overhead light were dark and steady, and they held the particular quality she had noticed from the first interview, the quality of a man who does not look away, not from anything, not ever, because looking away has never once been an option available to him. "I'm showing you the Fresno pattern," she said. "That's what I've decided." Something moved across Troy Landis's face then, something without a clean name. Something that existed outside the vocabulary of a man who had spent 20 years making sure he did not have the kinds of feelings that required vocabulary. It crossed his expression like weather crosses open ground, briefly, completely, leaving the landscape altered in ways that were visible if you were paying the right kind of attention. Roxanne was always paying the right kind of attention. He reached for the ledger. His hands were still dark with grease, and he was careful, deliberate in the way he was deliberate about everything that mattered, careful not to touch her fingers where they held the spine. He didn't quite manage it. The contact lasted less than a second, his knuckle against the side of her index finger, warm and certain, grease rough against her skin. He took the ledger. She let it go. Neither of them acknowledged it in any way that could be named or referenced or filed under anything except the category of things Roxanne was keeping, still, on the shelf beside the 1952 quarterly summary. That shelf was getting crowded. Troy opened the ledger. He looked at the page she had marked, the Fresno accounts laid out in her precise, unambiguous hand, 18 months of theft from the most dangerous man in the valley documented with the kind of clarity that left no argument. When he looked up, his expression had settled back into its usual stillness. But the stillness was different now, charged with something underneath it, the way the valley air goes different in the hour before a storm that the sky hasn't shown you yet. "Sit down," he said. "Show me where it starts." She sat down. She showed him. Outside, Cinder Road was dark and quiet, and entirely unaware that the most feared man in 3 counties was learning, for the first time, that the woman he had hired to keep his books had kept his secrets longer, and that somewhere between day 3 and this Tuesday evening, the question of why she had done that had become the most important question in the room. It was the hottest afternoon of what had already been an unreasonably hot summer, and Roxanne was leaving 20 minutes early for the first time since she had started at Lannis Automotive, because the heat coming through the office window had reached the specific temperature at which even numbers stopped making sense, and the only reasonable response is to go somewhere with a fan. She had her satchel, she had her jacket folded over her arm, she was at the threshold of the garage bay, one foot already pointed toward the lot, when she looked up and saw them. 2 cars, moving across the bleached expanse of the lot from the far entrance, slowly, with the particular unhurried patience of people who are not concerned about being seen. Dark vehicles, expensive in their anonymity. They were not turning, they were not slowing further. They were coming directly toward the garage with the straight, purposeful line of men who had already decided what happened next and were simply closing the distance to where it happened. Roxanne had reconciled enough of Choi's accounts by now to understand, in the precise way numbers make things clear, what category of visitor arrived without announcement in vehicles like those. Her body understood before her mind finished the calculation. Her hands found the satchel strap and pulled it against her chest without being asked, knuckles going white on the buckle, shoulders drawing in. Troy was beside her in 3 seconds. She hadn't heard him come from the bay. She hadn't heard anything. And then he was simply there, the way he was always simply there when the situation required it, as though the building notified him of things that needed his attention. He still had the car keys in his right hand, loose in his fist, the signet ring catching the flat, white afternoon light. He did not look at her. He looked at the cars, reading them with the focused, dispassionate attention of a man running a calculation of his own, one that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the kind of arithmetic that ends in consequences. Whatever he calculated, his face gave nothing away. Not alarm, not surprise, certainly not fear. What settled across his expression instead was something colder and more deliberate than any of those things. The specific composure of a man who has been expecting this particular debt to come due and has already decided in advance exactly how he intends to pay it. He took 1 step forward, just one, placing himself at the front edge of the threshold, his body fractionally ahead of hers, between her and whatever was crossing the lot. He did not make a performance of it. He simply moved, and the geometry of the doorway changed, and she was behind him. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet and completely without fear. Go to the back office, lock the door. Do not open it until I knock 3 times. What is... Roxanne, just her name. Her first name, which he had never used before. Not once in 6 weeks of daily proximity, of late evenings and ledgers, and the careful, deliberate distance they had both been maintaining by unspoken agreement. It stopped her the way a hand on her arm would have stopped her, more completely, because it was not a gesture she could step around. He was still watching the lot. His jaw was set. The keys turned once in his loose fist, that single unconscious habit, the one tell she had identified in the first week. 3 knocks, he said. No exceptions. She went. She walked back through the bay, past the red toolbox, past the pegboard, past the gray suit jacket hanging alone on its hook in exactly the same place it always hung, and into the back office, and she turned the lock, and she sat down in her chair with the satchel still pressed against her chest and listened to the silence. From the lot, after a moment, the sound of car doors, voices, low and male, and carrying the specific flat courtesy of men who were not being courteous. Then Troy's voice, quieter than theirs, slower than theirs, with the unhurried authority of a man who does not raise his volume because he is never needed to. She could not make out the words. She did not try. Instead, she sat in the yellow lampshade of the office she had rebuilt from disorder, and she pressed her palms flat against the desk, that grounding habit, that need for something solid, And she did the thing she always did when she needed to understand a situation clearly. She ran the numbers. She was afraid. That was real, and she did not minimize it. But she ran the calculation further, the way she always ran calculations to their end, rather than stopping at the first uncomfortable result. And what she found at the bottom of it stopped her completely. She was not afraid of what was crossing the lot, not of the men in those vehicles, not of whatever business had brought them to Cinder Road, not of the world Troy Landis inhabited that she had been reading in his ledgers for 6 weeks. She was afraid of how completely, how immediately, how without hesitation she had trusted the man who sent her to safety. 1 step forward, 3 words, and she had gone. Roxanne Swisher, who trusted carefully and slowly and only after extensive evidence, had walked away from a threat she could see because Troy Landis had said her name in a particular way. And the most alarming thing she could find anywhere in the calculation was that given the same moment again, she would do exactly the same thing. Outside, the voices continued. She kept her hands flat on the desk. She waited for 3 knocks. The lot went quiet in the way that lots go quiet after certain kinds of things have happened in them, not peacefully, but with the heavy, settled stillness of a problem that has been resolved in the only language it understood. Roxanne sat in the back office and listened to it. She had her satchel in her lap. She had not moved it. She was not entirely sure when she had picked it up or whether she had been holding it the whole time, but her hands knew what to do with it, and she had let them. 3 knocks at the door, measured, certain, the specific knock of a man who keeps his promises. "Come in," she said. Troy filled the door frame and then the room. He had lost the jacket somewhere. She would find out later it was in the trunk of one of the cars that had left, which told her something about the nature of what had happened on that lot, that she filed away without comment. The work shirt was torn at the left shoulder seam, a clean split that exposed the white undershirt beneath. There was a cut at his jaw, small, already past bleeding, darkening at the edges, that he had not addressed and apparently had no intention of addressing. He sat in the chair across the desk from her without being invited, which had always been his way, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked at her, that flat, reading look, the way he might look at a situation he was still finishing his assessment of. Roxanne opened the second drawer on the left. She took out the first aid kit, white tin, Red Cross, purchased on her second day and organized into the desk the same afternoon along with the spare pencils and the rubber bands and the things a back office needed to function properly. She set it on the desk between them. She did not open it. She did not hand it to him. She left it there, squarely between them, which was not an offering so much as a statement of available options. What he did with it was his decision. He looked at the tin, then at her. Then he picked it up. She watched him clean the cut himself, cotton, iodine, the brief tightening around his eyes that was the only indication it stung, and she waited until he had finished before she spoke. "The Fresno accounts, the men on that lot, they're the same operation, aren't they?" "Yes." "They've been funding themselves through your books for 18 months. "Yes." "You didn't know until I showed you." A pause. The iodine-soaked cotton turned dark between his fingers. He set it on the desk with the precise, contained motion of a man deciding how to carry something. "No," he said. Roxanne folded her hands on the desk. She had thought in the locked office while the lot was being resolved about how she was going to say this, about whether there was a careful, diplomatic, professionally appropriate way to ask a man who ran a criminal empire to explain himself to his bookkeeper. She had concluded there was not, and that attempting one would insult them both. "I want to know what the ring means," she said. "The real answer, not what a mechanic in Maple Hill would say, the real one." Troy set the first aid kit down. He looked at her from across the desk, across the neat stacks of ledgers and the lamp throwing its yellow circle and the first aid tin and the 4 inches of air between them that had been carrying more weight than 4 inches of air should reasonably be expected to carry. And he was quiet for long enough that Roxanne understood he was not gathering words. He was making a decision. a significant one, of the kind that, once made, could not be walked back. Then he told her. Not everything. She understood that without being told. There were things that lived at the center of what Troy Landis was that he would not hand to anyone across a desk on a Tuesday evening. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But enough. The valley and how his grandfather had taken it, not inherited it, taken it, piece by piece over a decade of patience and precision and the specific kind of violence that leaves no witnesses. The operation his father had grown and systematized. The ring, given at 18 with one sentence. When you wear this, everything it has ever meant is yours to keep or lose. He told her what it meant to have kept it, what the Thursday meetings were, what the men in the Bay reported and to whom, and why the sheriff of Maple Hill had not looked directly at a Landis in 11 years. He told her about the partner who had tried, 8 years ago, to take what the ring represented and what had happened to that man, stated plainly, without embellishment, as fact. When he finished, the room was very quiet. The lamp hummed. Outside, Cinder Road was dark and completely still. "Why are you telling me this?" Roxanne asked. Troy looked at the ring. He turned it once on his finger, a small movement, unconscious, the only nervous habit she had ever observed in him. And then he looked at her with a directness that had unsteadied her since the first interview and had not stopped since. "Because you already know," he said, "and because I find I'm tired of pretending you don't." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It had weight and warmth and the particular quality of something that has been decided without being spoken. A door opened not by dramatic gesture, but by one man saying a true thing in a quiet room to the one person he had apparently determined was allowed to hear it. Roxanne looked at him, at the torn shoulder seam and the cleaned cut and the ring that had outlasted every enemy 3 generations of his family had ever made. At the man who controlled 3 counties and had just handed her, across a neat office desk at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, more truth than most people in Maple Hill had been trusted with in their entire lives. She thought about the shelf, the one where she kept the 1952 quarterly summary, and the question of the suit jacket, and the almost touch in the Bay, and everything else she had been declining to reconcile. She thought it might be time to clear it. "All right," she said. 2 words, but Troy Landis, who understood the weight of language better than most men understood anything, looked at her when she said them as though she had handed him something he had not known he was waiting for. They took her on a Wednesday morning. Cleanly, professionally. 2 men she had never seen before. A car with plates she would later learn had been issued to a company that ceased to exist the day after they were printed. Mrs. Eloise was at the market. The boarding house was quiet. Roxanne had her satchel over her shoulder and her hand on the front gate, and then she did not. No marks, no raised voices, the kind of operation that announced by its very precision exactly who ordered it and how long they had been planning it and what they thought of the man they were using her to reach. The message arrived at Landis Automotive 40 minutes later. The ledgers, complete, unredacted, every account and every name and every arrangement that kept Troy's operation breathing in exchange for the bookkeeper. Simple, clean, the kind of offer that had only one logical answer. His 3 most senior men were in the office when the message came. They had worked for Troy Landis for a combined 37 years, and they knew, collectively, everything there was to know about how he thought and what he valued and how the calculation was supposed to go. They laid it out for him anyway, because that was their job. The ledgers against the woman, the empire against the employee, the architecture of everything he had built against a bookkeeper who had been in Maple Hill for 6 weeks. The ledgers won, obviously, logically, inescapably. Every one of them understood it. Roxanne Swisher was an acceptable loss, A regrettable one, perhaps, but the kind of regret a man in Troy's position factored into his costs and moved past, because the alternative was handing his enemies the keys to 3 counties' worth of criminal infrastructure and watching 40 years of his family's work dissolve in an afternoon. Troy listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he stood up, walked to the hook on the back wall, and put on the gray suit jacket. "Stay here," he said. Not one of them followed. The warehouse sat at the far edge of the impound lot, Troy's lot, though the company name on the deed was 3 layers removed from anything traceable, and his enemies did not know it. He had chosen the meet point himself, through the intermediary, for exactly this reason. In negotiations, geography is leverage. Troy Landis had not survived 40 years of his family's history by walking into rooms he did not own. He walked in with no ledgers, no leverage, nothing in his hands except the car keys and the ring. There were 4 of them inside. They had Roxanne seated against the far wall with her satchel still on her lap. They had not taken it, which told him something about how they had underestimated her, and by extension, him. She looked up when he entered. Her face was composed in the way he had come to recognize as her particular form of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep functioning in spite of it. She had been making that decision since day 3. He had simply not understood until recently what it cost her. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, long enough to communicate what he needed to communicate without words, which was, "I see you. Stay still. This will not take long." Then he turned his attention to the 4 men, and what followed in that warehouse on the far edge of the impound lot was not a negotiation. It was a demonstration of what the signet ring had always meant in this valley, of what 3 generations of Landis men had built and defended, and what Troy had inherited and refined and made, if anything, more absolute than the generation before him. Of what it cost, specifically, measurably, finally, to take something that belonged to him. It was not pleasant. It was entirely effective. By the time it was finished, the Fresno operation had ceased to exist as a functioning concern, and the men who had run it understood, in the permanent and irreversible way of men who have been shown, rather than told, that the valley had an owner, and his patience was not a resource they had been wise to exhaust. He drove her back to Cinder Road himself. The valley in late afternoon was gold and white, the light coming in low and flat across the dry fields, turning the dust on the windshield into something that almost looked like weather. Roxanne sat in the passenger seat with the satchel on her lap and her hands folded over it, and said nothing for the first 3 miles. Troy said nothing either. He drove with the windows down and the hot air moving through the car, and the keys, always in his hand or on the seat beside him, resting against his thigh. "You didn't bring the ledgers," she said. "No." "They would have let me go for the ledgers." "Yes." "Why didn't you bring them?" The road ran straight into the late sun. A hawk turned in a slow circle over the field to the left. Troy drove, and the silence stretched, and Roxanne had decided he was not going to answer when he spoke, very quietly, without taking his eyes from the road. Because books can be rebuilt, some things cannot. Roxanne looked at him, at the strong jaw and the straight road ahead and the hands on the wheel, and she noticed with the precise observational clarity that had served her since day 3, that his knuckles were not entirely steady. Troy Landis, who had walked into a warehouse full of his enemies with nothing in his hands, and walked out having ended them, who had never in 6 weeks of daily proximity displayed a single moment of involuntary feeling. His knuckles were not steady on the wheel. Roxanne faced forward. She did not say anything. She understood with the same certainty she brought to a balance sheet that finally reconciled that she did not need to. Some things, once settled, required no further accounting. 3 days passed. The heat did not break. This was July in the San Joaquin Valley, and the heat would not break for another 6 weeks. Would not break until it was good and ready, indifferent as the valley had always been to what the people living inside it wanted or needed, or had quietly decided they could no longer endure. But something else had. Roxane knew it the way she knew a balance sheet that had finally reconciled, not with relief exactly, more with the calm that comes when a long calculation reaches its correct answer and you can set the pencil down. She had spent 3 days in her room at Mrs. Eloise's, eating the meals that appeared outside her door without comment, and reading the same page of the same book 4 times, and doing, ultimately, the only thing she had ever been truly equipped to do. She had run every column. She had looked at the full picture, the ring and the suit jacket, and the Thursday men, and the ghost accounts, and the warehouse, and the unsteady knuckles on the drive home. And she had done the arithmetic that the last 8 weeks had been building toward. The answer was not tidy. It was not particularly safe. It was not the kind of answer that fit in any letter she could write to her mother. It was the only answer the numbers gave. On the 4th morning, she put on her white floral dress, picked up her brown leather satchel, and walked to Cinder Road. The garage bay was open. The lot beyond it shimmered in the morning heat, flat and white and utterly indifferent. She stood at the threshold, the same open mouth of the building, the same bleached sky pressing down, and looked in. Troy was at the workbench with his back to her, bent over an engine block that had been pulled from something she didn't recognize. Work shirt, white undershirt, the gold ring on his right hand, the car keys on the bench beside him. He was working the way he always worked, with total, focused silence, the kind of attention that left no room for anything outside the task, which was the same quality he brought to everything that mattered to him, and which she had spent 8 weeks cataloging without entirely meaning to. He heard her. She knew he heard her because every man in every room had always heard Roxane arrive. She had never been the kind of person who went unnoticed, whatever she told herself about keeping her head down and doing her work, and not becoming part of anything larger than a clean set of books. Troy set down his wrench, turned, looked at her standing in the threshold with the satchel in her hand and the white lot blazing behind her, and he went very still in the way he went still when he was processing something that required his full attention. He said nothing. He waited. Because Troy Landis, who had built an empire on knowing precisely when to speak and when to let silence do the work, understood that this was a moment for silence. Roxane stepped out of the light and into the shadow of the garage. "I finished the quarterly summary," she said. "It's on your desk." "Thank you." "The Fresno accounts are fully documented. Everything, 18 months, every shell company, the full routing structure, for whatever you need to do with it." "I know. I read it." She crossed the bay to the workbench, set the satchel down on it, next to the car keys. The two things sat there together, her leather satchel with its brass buckles worn smooth from daily handling, his keys on their plain ring, and neither of them looked at the arrangement directly, but both of them were aware of it in the specific way of people who understand that small gestures in the right moment carry the weight of long conversations. "I have a condition," she said. Something moved behind Troy's eyes, careful, controlled, the expression of a man who has learned not to want things too visibly because wanting things has historically given other people leverage, and leverage has historically been used against him. But it moved. She saw it. "Tell me your condition," he said. "Honest books." She held his gaze the way she had held it since the first interview, steady and clear and entirely without performance. "Whatever else this is, the ring, the suit, the Thursdays, all of it, I keep honest books. You don't ask me to change a number. Not one, not ever." Troy looked at her. at this woman who had walked into his garage 8 weeks ago with her satchel and her arithmetic and her clear, particular eyes, and proceeded, with the unhurried patience of someone very good at finding things that have been hidden, to see everything he was: the empire and the dynasty and the warehouse, and the precise cold calculation of a man who has survived by treating sentiment as a liability, and had decided with full information that the view was something she could live with. The only person in 20 years who had looked directly at him and not looked away. "Agreed," he said. She nodded, picked up the satchel, walked past him through the bay to the back office, past the red toolbox and the pegboard and the gray suit jacket hanging alone on its hook, pressed and waiting, belonging to the man he became when the work shirt came off and the valley needed reminding who owned its silence. She sat at her desk, opened the new ledger she had ordered 10 days ago, clean pages, sharp pencil, the first line waiting with the particular blankness of something that has not yet been written, but knows it will be. Behind her, from the bay, she heard Troy pick up his wrench, the sound of him going back to work, the same focused rhythm she had come to know, as well as the sound of her own breathing. Metal on metal, the small, precise adjustments of a man who understood engines the way she understood numbers, by instinct and habit, and the long practice of paying attention to things other people walked past. Neither of them said anything else. They did not need to. Some agreements, once made between people who mean them, require no further language. The books would stay honest, the jacket would stay on its hook, the ring would go on meaning what it had always meant, and Roxanne West Swisher would go on being the one person in 3 counties who knew exactly what that was and had chosen, with open eyes and a clean ledger and the full weight of the arithmetic behind her, to stay anyway. She wrote the date at the top of the first page, set the pencil down, read it back. It was correct. It was always correct. She picked the pencil back up and began. The Heatwave of 1955 brought Roxanne W. Swisher to Maple Hill, California. It brought her to a garage at the end of Cinder Road and a man in a faded blue shirt who held car keys the way other men hold weapons and wore a gold ring that meant he owned the silence of 3 counties. She came for honest wages. She stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with the wages and everything to do with the particular way Troy V. Landis said her name in the dark of his garage bay, like it was something he had been keeping safe. The heat wave broke eventually. The summer ended. The books stayed honest, and the gray suit jacket on the back wall hook stayed exactly where it was, because some things about a man do not change. They just find someone worth changing in front of.